It's been 1 month since a 7.7 magnitude earthquake struck central Myanmar, and millions are still in need of humanitarian assistance. Thomas Kean from the International Crisis Group says there's evidence to suggest both sides of the conflict have breached the ceasefire.
Both sides have declared unilateral ceasefires to allow for earthquake response activities. But there is evidence that both sides have been violating the ceasefire, most obviously with the military regime carrying out airstrikes right across the country, really, in many states and regions, including some earthquake-affected areas. But we have also seen ethnic armed groups and anti-military forces carry out attacks, even capture pretty important towns in some parts of the country, in the north and the west. There is a fair bit of evidence that both sides are continuing to fight despite the ceasefire announcements.
And what is the state of the civil war at the moment? Is there a side that's gaining more ground than the other?
Certainly, the military regime is in an extremely weak position. I don't think we've seen the Myanmar military in such a weak position since independence, so we're talking over 70 years. Ethnic armed groups and resistance forces have taken control of many areas of the country, particularly in the border areas. But the military is fighting back, and in some areas it's also making, recapturing some territory. And the weakness of the regime has also prompted a stronger intervention from China. So recently it forced an ethnic armed group to give up control of a major town and to hand it back to the military regime. And this is really quite an unprecedented intervention from China in Myanmar's conflict, but one that it felt compelled to do because the military was so weak, and I think it feared that the regime might even collapse if Beijing didn't intervene.
Mm. And how has the earthquake impacted the humanitarian situation, which was already dire with 2.5 million people displaced?
Yeah, exactly. And on top of those displaced, almost 20 million in need of aid prior to the earthquake. There are hundreds of thousands of more people have been displaced as a result of the earthquake. Many are still living outdoors. They're too afraid to go back into their homes, which may not have collapsed but have been damaged, and there's just been a series of aftershocks over the past month in Myanmar that have made people very worried to return to their homes. The relief operation has largely been led by local organisations. The military, the regime, has been nowhere to be seen for the most part on the ground. And international organisations, to some extent, like the UN, of course, have been carrying out relief activities, but funding is relatively limited. The US, for example, which would normally be a leader here and be providing much of the funding, has pledged only $9 million, which is less than many other countries. And so the international response has been somewhat limited, and it has been largely local organisations, charity groups, volunteer groups, that have been providing the bulk of support to affected communities in central Myanmar.
And are you hopeful that aid can continue to get through even as the fighting continues?
Well, one of the interesting things about the earthquake is the regime response. And, we were talking about the ceasefire earlier and how that hasn't really resulted in a reduction of fighting. But the military probably hasn't tried to exercise as much control over international and local relief activities as certainly I feared they would. They haven't tried to politicize it as much as they have in the past, and they haven't tried to put in place as many restrictions and to control relief activities. And I think that speaks to the weakness of the regime, both in the sense that it's just stretched, fighting on so many fronts across the country, but also the fact that the earthquake struck mainly regime-controlled areas, the major cities like Mandalay and Naypyidaw and Sagaing as well. And so to some extent, it is keen to see assistance reach those areas. These are areas under its control, and it simply doesn't have the resources to provide that assistance itself. So I think there is opportunities here. The international community should be pressing the regime to allow more assistance. There are of course, these concerns that aid will be politicized. But, if we're not making an effort to try to take advantage of the opportunities that are there to help people, we won't know, what's possible. So it is really important that the international community steps up to complement and to support that local response that we are seeing on the ground.
And 1 month on, have rebuilding efforts begun? Residents, have they begun returning to their homes, or is it really difficult given the situation at the moment in the country?
It really depends on, where they're living, whether they're in a rural area or an urban area. In urban areas, that's where, like Mandalay and Naypyidaw, that's where the damage has been worst. I mean, you've got multi-story buildings, for example. There were a lot of buildings that collapsed, but also a lot that just suffered structural damage and may not be safe, even though they haven't collapsed. And so that's going to take a long time, not only to clear the debris from the collapsed buildings, but also to assess those buildings. And that's even, the damaged structures. And that's even before you get into rebuilding. And really, there isn't going to be the resources to help people rebuild, either from the military regime or the international community. And so it is going to be up to communities themselves primarily to rebuild and to recover from this disaster. And, the people of Myanmar have gone through so much already with first COVID, but then also the coup in 2021 and the conflict, which has stretched on for more than 4 years now. So this is really one disaster on top of another, and it's very hard for people to bear, this kind of disaster and the impact it's had.
Indeed. Thomas Kean, good to talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much.